Every single US president has done something that satisfies their legacy, from doubling the nation's entire landmass, to ending wars that could have wiped out civilization, to building infrastructure you literally drive on every single day. Today, I'm breaking down the single biggest accomplishment of every US president, and we're starting with the one who set the rules for everyone else. George Washington. Washington's biggest accomplishment wasn't winning the Revolutionary War. It wasn't the Constitution. It was leaving. In 1797, George Washington voluntarily walked away from power after 2 terms, and that might sound normal to us now, but at the time, it was one of the most radical political acts in human history. Every revolutionary leader before him had clung to power until they died or got overthrown. King George III himself reportedly said that if Washington actually stepped down, he'd be the greatest man in the world. And he did. That single decision created the 2-term precedent that held for 150 years. No law enforced it, no amendment required it. Every president after him simply followed Washington's example because the example was that powerful. It wasn't until FDR won 4 consecutive elections that Congress finally stepped in with the 22nd Amendment in 1951 to formalize what Washington had just chosen to do on his own. But stepping down wasn't all he built. Washington created the entire cabinet system from scratch in 1789, appointed the first Supreme Court with John Jay as Chief Justice, and essentially designed the executive branch with zero blueprint to follow. Every president since has operated inside the framework he invented. His 1796 farewell address warned against political parties and foreign entanglements. Politicians still quote it today, over 200 years later. That's not a legacy, that's a foundation. But Washington had the luxury of building a country from nothing. The next president on our list had to make it bigger. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson made the single greatest impulse purchase in human history. In 1803, he bought 828,000 square miles of land from France for $15 million. That's roughly $2,833 per square mile in today's dollars. To put that in perspective, you can't even buy a decent studio apartment for that price now, and Jefferson got an entire chunk of a continent. The Louisiana Purchase literally doubled the size of the United States overnight. One day, America was this modest strip of land hugging the East Coast. The next, it stretched all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And here's the best part, nobody in Washington actually knew what was out there. Jefferson had just bought the equivalent of a mystery box the size of Western Europe. So what did he do? He sent 2 guys on a camping trip to figure it out. Lewis and Clark spent 2 years hiking through uncharted wilderness, cataloging plants, animals, and terrain that no American official had ever seen. Jefferson essentially handed them a map with a giant blank space and said, go fill that in. But the real flex, despite spending $15 million on the biggest land deal in history, Jefferson still managed to cut the national debt from $83 million down to $57 million during his presidency. He doubled the country's size and reduced what it owed. That's a financial magic trick that almost 0 presidents since have been able to replicate. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just expand America, it created the version of America we know today. But even Jefferson's nation-defining deal looks small compared to what one president had to do just to keep that nation from tearing itself apart. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't just free the slaves, he saved the country. And the tragic part is he didn't live long enough to see either one fully realized. The Emancipation Proclamation hit on January 1st, 1863, and people have debated its true purpose ever since. Was it a moral stand against the horror of slavery, or a calculated military strategy designed to cripple the Confederate economy by stripping them of their labor force? Here's the thing, it was both. Lincoln knew that freeing enslaved people in rebel states would destabilize the South's entire war machine while simultaneously redefining what the Union was actually fighting for. That's not a contradiction, that's genius. But the proclamation alone wasn't enough. It only applied to Confederate states, meaning slavery technically still existed in border states loyal to the Union. So Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment, the one that would abolish slavery everywhere, permanently, with 0 exceptions. He fought for it relentlessly through Congress, twisting arms and burning political capital like it was kindling. He never saw it ratified. Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The 13th Amendment wasn't formally ratified until December 18th, 1865, 8 months after his death. The man who held the country together through its bloodiest war and championed the total abolition of slavery was killed before either victory was fully complete. And beyond abolition, Lincoln fundamentally changed what the federal government could do. He established the first federal federal income tax. He created a national currency. These weren't temporary wartime measures. They permanently expanded the government's reach and built the financial infrastructure the country still runs on today. If the South had successfully seceded, the United States as we know it simply doesn't exist. But Lincoln's expansion of federal power was nothing compared to what one future president would do with it. A president who literally reshaped the land itself. Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt didn't just serve as president. He speed ran the entire job like it was a competition nobody else signed up for. Let's start with the thing that still matters most today. Roosevelt protected approximately 230 million acres of public land. That's 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game preserves, and 5 national parks. Roughly 10% of all US land set aside permanently. And he did this during the peak of America's industrial boom, when corporations were strip mining and clear cutting everything they could get their hands on. Nobody was thinking about conservation. Roosevelt looked at the most resource-hungry era in American history and said, no, actually, we're keeping this. But conservation wasn't even his full-time job. He busted 44 monopolies through antitrust lawsuits, going after giants like Standard Oil that had effectively swallowed entire industries whole. The government had been doing nothing about it for decades. Roosevelt walked in and started swinging. That's how he earned the nickname Trustbuster, and he wore it like a badge of honor. Then there's the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1906, Roosevelt mediated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, becoming the first American ever to win a Nobel Prize. Not just the first president, the first American, period. Most presidents struggled to get one major foreign policy win. Roosevelt grabbed his casually between fighting monopolies and literally creating the national park system. And if that wasn't enough, he championed the Panama Canal. It was completed in 1914, but Roosevelt's vision and early construction push made it happen. The canal cut approximately 8,000 miles off naval travel routes around Cape Horn and completely reshaped global maritime trade. The man was a walking highlight reel. Every single year of his presidency produced something that would have been another president's entire legacy. But there's another Roosevelt who somehow managed to match that energy during the 2 worst crises of the 20th century. Franklin D. Roosevelt. When the Great Depression hit, a quarter of Americans had no jobs. Banks were collapsing. Families were starving. The entire economy was in freefall, and the federal government's response up to that point was essentially good luck. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped in and did something no president had ever done before. He made the government responsible for its people. The New Deal, launched between 1933 and 1939, was the largest federal intervention in the American economy in history. The Works Progress Administration alone employed over 8.5 million people across public works projects. The Civilian Conservation Corps put another 3 million to work. Roads, bridges, schools, parks, all built by programs that didn't exist before FDR created them. But the crown jewel, the thing that outlasted everything else, was Social Security. Signed into law on August 14th, 1935, it established a federal safety net for retirees, the disabled, and the unemployed. That program is still running over 90 years later, covering tens of millions of Americans every single month. No other piece of New Deal legislation even comes close in terms of lasting impact. And here's the thing, FDR was so popular that he won 4 consecutive presidential elections: 1932, 1936, 1940, 1944. Remember how Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms and set the precedent? FDR shattered it so completely that Congress literally had to write the 2-term limit into the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment. Washington created the tradition. FDR forced them to make it law. Oh, and he also led the country through World War II, coordinated the Allied coalition, oversaw the D-Day invasion, and did all of it from a wheelchair that most Americans didn't even know about at the time. But the president who had to pick up where FDR left off, he had one of the hardest first days on the job in American history: Harry S. Truman. Truman might be the most underrated decision maker to ever sit in the Oval Office. This is a guy who inherited a world war, ended it in the most controversial way imaginable, and then rebuilt an entire continent, all while most people expected him to fail. Let's start with the elephant in the room. On August 6, 1945, Truman ordered the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The war in the Pacific ended almost immediately, but the debate over whether it was the right call has never ended. Supporters point to the estimated hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese casualties a land invasion would have cost. Critics argue Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that the bombings were unnecessary. Here's the thing, there are serious, legitimate arguments on both sides, and nobody has settled this in over 80 years. That alone tells you something about the weight of that decision, but Truman's legacy goes way beyond the bomb. In 1948, he committed around $13 billion, roughly $170 billion in today's money, to the Marshall Plan. The goal was simple: rebuild Western Europe before the Soviet Union could swoop in and turn economically devastated nations into communist states. It worked. Countries like France, West Germany, and Italy stabilized, industrialized, and aligned with the West. Then in April 1949, he helped establish NATO, the first permanent peacetime military alliance in American history. Over 75 years later, it's still the backbone of Western collective security. And here's something that gets criminally overlooked. On July 26, 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the entire United States military. This was years before the civil rights movement gained real momentum. Members of his own party fought him on it. He did it anyway. The man dropped 2 atomic bombs, rebuilt Europe, created NATO, and desegregated the military, all in roughly 7 years. But the president who followed him reshaped the country in a completely different way, one you literally drive on every single day. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower built the single largest public works project in American history, and he built it for the wrong reason. That's what makes it so fascinating. In 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, authorizing 41,000 miles of interstate highways at a cost of $25 billion, roughly $220 billion in today's money. His justification was purely military. During World War II, Eisenhower had seen Germany's Autobahn firsthand and realized the United States had zero infrastructure capable of moving troops and heavy equipment across the country at speed. So he fixed that. But here's the thing, the highways didn't become a military tool. They became the physical spine of American commerce, suburban expansion, and culture itself. Entire cities reshaped themselves around highway exits. The American suburb as we know it exists because Eisenhower wanted to move tanks faster. That gap between intention and outcome might be the most accidentally transformative decision any president has ever made. And the highways weren't even his only legacy. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first federal civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. When Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus tried to block 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne Division to escort them inside. A 5-star general put paratroopers on American soil to enforce desegregation. That moment doesn't get talked about enough. He also founded NASA in 1958 as a direct response to the Soviet Sputnik launch, literally kickstarting the space race. And then, on his way out the door, he delivered his farewell address on January 17, 1961, warning the country about the growing power of the military-industrial complex. A career military man, the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, spending his final moments in office telling America to be afraid of the military's influence. That warning still anchors political debates over 60 years later. But if Eisenhower set the stage for the space race, the next president turned it into a national obsession. John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is the president who changed the world and never got to see it happen. Almost everything he started, someone else had to finish. And that makes his legacy one of the most bittersweet in American history. Let's start with the big one. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the decade was over. At the time, America could barely keep an astronaut in orbit. The technology didn't exist. The infrastructure didn't exist. The program would ultimately cost $280 billion in today's dollars, and Kennedy wouldn't live to see any of it. He was assassinated on November 22, 1963. The moon landing happened on July 20th, 1969, more than 5 years after his death. But without that singular, almost reckless commitment, it never happens. Then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962, 13 days. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba pointed at American cities. Most people alive at the time had zero idea how close the world actually came to ending. Kennedy's response was a naval blockade combined with back-channel diplomacy with Khrushchev, and it worked. No shots fired, no missiles launched. The world pulled back from the edge, and Kennedy's handling of those 13 days days is still studied as one of the greatest acts of crisis management in modern history. He also established the Peace Corps in 1961, deploying volunteers to 44 countries by the end of 1963 as a soft power alternative to military force during the Cold War. And he pushed the civil rights legislation that eventually became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, building the political momentum even though he never lived to sign it. Was Kennedy perfect? No. He escalated American involvement in Vietnam, a decision that would haunt the country for over a decade. But the moon commitment and the missile crisis alone are legitimately world-altering achievements. And the man who inherited all of Kennedy's unfinished business, that story is even more complicated. Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1965, black voter registration across the South sat at 29%. 4 years later, it was 52%, a 23-point jump in 4 years. That's not gradual progress. That's a single piece of legislation detonating an entire system of suppression overnight. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated literacy tests and authorized federal oversight of voter registration in states with histories of discrimination, and the numbers moved immediately. But that was just one bill. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin at a federal level. He then created Medicare and Medicaid on July 30th, 1965, extending healthcare coverage to seniors and low-income Americans. Those two programs now cover over 150 million people. They're not historical artifacts. They're active, living policy that millions of Americans depend on right now, and he wasn't done. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 eliminated the national origin quotas that had shaped who could enter America since the 1920s. That single law fundamentally reshaped the demographic trajectory of the entire country for the next 6 decades. This is arguably the most transformative stretch of domestic legislation since FDR's New Deal. Nobody else on this list stacks that many structural changes in that short a window. And then Vietnam destroyed everything. Operation Rolling Thunder, the Gulf of Tonkin, 500,000 American troops deployed to Southeast Asia. Johnson's approval collapsed. The Great Society, this genuinely historic domestic legacy, got buried under body counts and protest footage. By 1968, he chose not to run for re-election. The man who reshaped American civil rights, healthcare, and immigration couldn't survive a war he escalated. Here's the thing about LBJ, there's no clean version of his story. You can't separate the president who changed more American lives through domestic policy than almost anyone from the president who sent a generation into a war that killed over 58,000 of them. Both things are completely true, and neither one cancels the other out. But if Johnson's legacy is complicated, the next president's is something else entirely. Richard Nixon. Nixon's biggest accomplishment isn't Watergate, obviously, but you'd never know that from the way people talk about him, because on February 21st, 1972, Richard Nixon did something that genuinely stunned the entire planet. He walked into Beijing and reopened diplomatic relations with China after 23 years of complete isolation, and nobody saw it coming. Literally nobody. The whole thing was orchestrated in total secrecy through National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, who made covert trips to Beijing without even telling most of the US government what was happening. When Nixon finally announced the visit, allies were blindsided, adversaries were blindsided, the press had zero advance warning. It was one of the most dramatic diplomatic reveals in modern history. But here's the thing, it wasn't just a handshake photo op. The strategic logic behind it was Cold War triangulation at its finest. By engaging China, Nixon drove a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, two communist powers that were already feuding but still loosely aligned. Now the US had leverage over both of them simultaneously. You want to negotiate with the Soviets? Great, just remind them you're also talking to China. It's considered one of the most tactically sophisticated foreign policy moves of the entire 20th century, and it came from a guy most people only associate with a tape recorder and a resignation letter. Speaking of things nobody associates with Nixon, he also signed the EPA into law in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency. The entire modern framework for federal environmental regulation exists because of Richard Nixon. He signed the Clean Air Act amendments that same year. This almost never comes up in conversation, ever. He also negotiated the SALT I Treaty with the Soviet Union in 1972, placing formal limits on nuclear weapons for the first time through a bilateral agreement. That's 3 major accomplishments that would define any other president's legacy. But Nixon resigned in August 1974, the only president to ever do so, and Watergate swallowed everything. The China opening, the EPA, the arms treaties, all of of it lives permanently in the shadow of a break-in and a cover-up. It's one of the biggest gaps between achievement and reputation in presidential history. But if Nixon's legacy got buried by scandal, the next president on this list built his entire legacy on ending someone else's crisis. Ronald Reagan. On March 23, 1983, Reagan went on national television and proposed building a space-based missile defense system that could shoot down Soviet nuclear weapons before they reached American soil. The press immediately called it Star Wars. Scientists called it impossible. The Pentagon couldn't even agree on how it would work. And here's the thing, it was never fully built. The technology didn't exist then, and arguably still doesn't at that scale today, but it might have won the Cold War anyway. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to find out whether it was real. The mere possibility that America could render their entire nuclear arsenal useless forced Moscow into an arms race they were already losing. Reagan was essentially bluffing with the most expensive poker face in human history, and the Soviets blinked. Now here's what most people don't realize. Reagan's biggest concrete arms achievement wasn't the buildup, it was the reduction. In 1987, he signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with the Soviet Union, and this wasn't just another cap on growth like previous agreements. This was the first arms control treaty in history that actually eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. Gone. Both sides destroyed their intermediate range missiles. The guy who called the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983 ended up signing the most significant disarmament agreement of the Cold War 4 years later. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 2 years after Reagan left office. How much credit he deserves is genuinely one of the most unresolved debates in modern history. His supporters say he broke them. His critics say the Soviet system was already collapsing under its own weight, and Reagan just happened to be standing nearby when the building fell. Then there's Reaganomics. Tax cuts, deregulation, and the end of stagflation. The economy expanded for years. He won 49 states in 1984, the largest electoral college victory in modern American history. But critics point to exploding deficits and rising wealth inequality as the price tag nobody mentions. Reagan's legacy is less a verdict and more an ongoing argument, and that argument gets even louder when we talk about the next president on this list, Barack Obama. Obama's presidency is the one most of you actually lived through, which makes it the hardest to evaluate honestly. But let's try anyway. On March 23, 2010, Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law. It was the largest expansion of federal healthcare coverage since Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, extending insurance to roughly 20 million previously uninsured Americans by 2016. Pre-existing conditions could no longer disqualify you from coverage. Millions of young adults stayed on their parents' plans. The uninsured rate dropped to historic lows. But here's the thing, the ACA also became the most politically polarizing domestic legislation of its era. Opponents pointed to rising premiums, shrinking insurer competition in rural markets, and a mandate that forced Americans to buy coverage or pay a penalty. Supporters said it saved lives. Opponents said it broke promises. Both sides had receipts. And in 2026, the debate still isn't settled. That's not a cop-out. That's just the reality of legislation this massive being evaluated in real time. Now, the moment everyone remembers. On May 2nd, 2011, Obama authorized the Navy SEAL raid on a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Nearly 10 years after September 11th, the man who planned the deaths of almost 3,000 Americans was dead, Osama bin Laden. The intelligence was uncertain, the political risk was enormous, and Obama gave the green light anyway. It remains the single most dramatic presidential decision of the 21st century so far. Beyond that, he signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, a $787 billion stimulus package responding to the Great Recession, one of the largest economic interventions in American history outside of wartime. He opened diplomatic relations with Cuba on December 17, 2014, ending 54 years of isolation in a move that drew immediate comparisons to Nixon's China opening, and none of this accounts for the historical weight of the office itself. Obama was the first black president of the United States. That fact alone shaped the intensity of both his support and his opposition in ways that political science will be unpacking for generations. Every president on this list made decisions that looked different 10 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later. Washington's precedents, Lincoln's proclamation, FDR's safety net, Reagan's Cold War gamble. The legacies shift, the debates evolve, and the only honest thing to say about Obama, or any of them, is that history isn't finished grading the test. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.